We need the jobs in Alberta, we need the jobs in Canada, and we need it now. Thank you.
Here.
There will be 6.5 minutes remaining in the time for questions and comments directed towards the honourable member for Edmonton West when the House next resumes debate on the question. But now we're going to statements by members. Déclaration de député. The honourable member for Mission, Matsqui Fraser Canyon.
Mr. Speaker, access to clean drinking water is a fundamental right for all Canadians. That is why on December the 10th, I was proud to stand alongside my provincial and municipal colleagues to announce the completion of the state-of-the-art $4.2 million Canal Lake water treatment plant. Thanks to $3 million from our government gas tax fund and $1.2 million from the District of Mission and City of Abbotsford. Over 200,000 residents of the Central Fraser Valley can now rest assured knowing they have access to safe and higher quality drinking water. This is an example of our government's commitment to modernizing infrastructure, ensuring Canada's quality of life continues to serve as an example to the world. And that should be a great source of pride for all members of this House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Barrie, Springwater, Oro-Medonte.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We in Barrie, Springwater, Oro-Medonte are proud of the beautiful Lake Simcoe. Lake Simcoe is a popular recreation area that generates millions of dollars per year in tourism, is a great agricultural hub, and supplies clean drinking water to 8 municipalities. The prospects of Lake Simcoe were not always so bright, with high phosphates, diminishing fish population, and a reduced number of species. Those of us who are lucky enough to work, live, and play around Lake Simcoe benefited from the previous Conservative government's successful investments with local not-for-profits to clean up the lake through the Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund. The fund invested over $60 million into revitalizing Lake Simcoe watershed and southeastern Georgian Bay. That funding is set to expire this year. Continued investment will ensure that future generations can enjoy the same clean lake and beautiful waterfront community that residents and tourists enjoy today. I want to call upon the current government to renew the Lake Simcoe and southeastern Georgian Bay Cleanup Fund in their coming budget.
Here. Honourable member for Calgary Skyview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I stand in the House in solidarity with all our Muslim brothers and sisters to mourn the victims of terrorist attack on the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec City. We must move forward by addressing the hate speech that incites violence against innocent Canadians because of their faith, ethnicity, place of birth, sexuality, or gender. We have shown the world that Canada is a tolerant country, but this doesn't mean we have made the hate go away. Instead, we must all pull together to continue to be a welcoming and thoughtful nation. I encourage Canadians to visit a mosque, a church, a temple, a synagogue, or any other place of worship, learn more about our fellow Canadians. Only through active engagement we can continue to thrive together and continue to be true north, strong and free. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Mr. Speaker, climate change is one of the greatest threats affecting humanity today. We need to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels, and we need to increase our public and private sector investment in renewable energy. However, Mr. Speaker, we have to do this in a way that's ethical. So local communities that are affected by new projects have to have consent to these projects, especially Indigenous communities, and energy projects also have to benefit low-income communities. So the challenge for all countries is to develop clean and ethical energy policy. Canada only has 18% of our energy coming from renewable sources, Mr. Speaker. That applies, that's opposed to Iceland, where it's 88%, and Norway and Sweden, where it's 45%. This government has been approving unclean and unethical projects such as the Kinder Morgan pipeline and clean projects that are unfortunately unethical, like the Site C Dam. I call on this government to support clean and ethical energy policy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Alfred Pellan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On February 24th, CLICS, the Laval Centre for Integration and Social Cohesion, will be organizing a symposium to underscore the first year of the arrival of Syrian refugees. I'm very proud to take part in this activity that will allow stakeholders and citizens to evaluate and analyze the work accomplished so far. It will also be an opportunity to discuss the way to welcome and accompany these new Laval citizens. Canada continues to be a welcoming land for refugees fleeing war. These are people who have survived unimaginable persecution and violence and who now have to completely restart their lives in a new country. Thanks to organizations like the Laval Cliques, their integration is easier. I thank all those who warmly welcome refugees and who make Canada the country that is open to diversity that we are so proud of. Alanwan Salan fi Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to recognize some of the great programs in Perth Wellington that celebrate our natural heritage and conservation efforts. For over 100 years, Perth Wellington has been home to some important environmental stewardship activities. And recently, a forestry consultant determined that the Monteith Farm in Perth County is home to the oldest tree plantation in Ontario. This proud history is today reflected in such tree planting programs as West Perth's Canada 150 Planted Tree Program, Trees for Minto, and the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority's Trees on Private Lands program. In Wellington County, the Green Legacy program has planted more than 1 million trees since 2004, making it the largest municipal tree planting program in North America. These programs have contributed to improving air quality, preventing soil erosion, creating natural windbreaks and snow fences, and enhancing our region's natural beauty. I look forward to more tree planting this spring across Perth Wellington. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Scarborough Agincourt.
Mr. Speaker, I am honoured to rise today to pay tribute to the Honourable Robert Stanbury, who passed away this past Friday morning in Burlington. Bob, as he was known, was first elected in 1965 in the riding of York-Scarborough and represented his constituents with distinction until 1977. Under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, he served as Minister responsible for Citizenship and Information, and then later as Minister of Communications, and finally as Minister of National Revenue. A dedicated public servant, lawyer, and father, Bob was also a force for Canada's North. He served as President of the Canadian Council for Native Business and was a founding member of the Nunavut Arbitration Board. His good nature, wisdom, and support will be missed by many, including the Minister of Democratic Institutions, for whom I know served as a mentor to her. I take comfort knowing that he enriched the lives of many through his strength, compassion, and leadership. We join Bob's family and friends in mourning his loss. We thank you, Bob, knowing that Canada is a better society for your contributions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for London West.
Mr. Speaker, on Saturday, scientists around the world marked International Day of Women and Girls in Science. This prestigious day was formally adopted by the UN in December 2015 as a way to demonstrate the continuing resolve of member states, including Canada, to eliminate gender inequality in the sciences. Right now, only 22% of people working in STEM fields are women. STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. We can and must do better. Our government is committed to improving that number. The Minister of Science has taken a series of concrete actions that address gender imbalance in research, including reinstating the University College Academic Survey, making changes to the Canada Excellence Research Chairs program to increase equity provisions, and launching an advertising campaign to encourage women and girls to pursue STEM careers. The Minister's actions build on our government's commitment to diversity, to equality, and to providing opportunities for all.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-Lérable. Mr. Speaker, all my colleagues know that I'm committed in the Free the Beer campaign by my colleague for Foothills. In Mégantic-Lérable, anyone who thinks of beer thinks of Maurice Legendre, the best independent beer agent in Quebec. He left us recently at the age of 90. He was born in Lac-Mégantic in 1926 and started out in Thetford Mines at 19 as a representative for Boswell beer. In 1952, he became the first seller of Dow beer in Quebec. In 1969, Dow and O'Keefe merged, and this was success for Maurice. In 1983, he sold 600,000 cases of beer, 90% of the market in bars and hotels. And yet, apparently, he never let beer touch his lips. He was very involved in his community, especially in sports development. Maurice taught me how to shake hands, and I think, without being partisan, I can say that he contributed to making me successful in politics. I hope there's beer in heaven for Maurice, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Marc-Aurèle-Fortin. Mr. Speaker, last week I was in St. John, New Brunswick, as part of the study by the HoC Committee on Poverty Reduction Strategies. I took part in public hearings and visited many organizations that help the most vulnerable. I was touched to discover an organization called Elementary Literacy that accompanies young readers who are having difficulty in either official language. I thank my colleague for St. John Rothsay, the committee staff, and all the local stakeholders for these meetings. Let's also point out the efforts of the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development, who's just announced 2 important initiatives linked to the Canadian Poverty Reduction Strategy. I'm confident that the National Advisory Process and the Ministerial Advisory Committee on Poverty launched today.
Southwest.
Monsieur le Président, il me fait plaisir aujourd'hui.
I'm very pleased today to underscore Black History Month.
It's one of the earliest black settlements. Established in 1806 by black loyalists, settlers were promised freedom in exchange for their loyalty to the British Crown. Like many other loyalists who arrived in New Brunswick, they were given land grants and supplies, and Elm Hill became a thriving farm community. Despite their past and ongoing struggles, Elm Hill residents are a living reminder of Canada's proud history of freedom, tolerance, and openness. Elm Hill's story is an incredibly rich gold mine of oral and anecdotal history. As the member of New Brunswick Southwest, I'm honored to play a part in its sharing and preservation. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary-Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to bring to your attention in this House the plight of the Kurds, who are indigenous to the western parts of Iran. The Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan is an official Kurdish political party dedicated to finding a peaceful solution to coexist with Iran and which advocates for the political rights of the Kurds. Kurds are subject to systemic and targeted persecution by the Iranian regime, which includes economic, political, and cultural discrimination, as well as the gross violation of human rights. Kurdish children are prevented from learning their language. Kurds are refused government jobs when they apply for failing to adhere to strict Shiite doctrines. And Kurdish prisoners are jailed for extended periods of time without trial, are subject to extrajudicial killing, and executions without due process. This Liberal government keeps talking about rewarding Iran with an embassy, but instead, Canada should hold Iran accountable and stand in solidarity with our allies, the Kurds of eastern Kurdistan, against the persecution they continue to endure.
The honourable member for Fleetwood Port Kells.
Mr. Speaker, when our minister responsible for youth launched the concept of riding-based youth councils, he unleashed an incredible force that's energizing communities right across Canada. Our youth council in Fleetwood Port Kells is a team of overachievers, and I'll bet we can say that about most of these councils. I want to check in with you, see how your donut and pizza budgets are holding up. Under the leadership of Kyle Boutillier, they've been digging into the big issues, informing their perspectives and visions, and getting ready to lead the country. For example, our Youth Council will be joining with others across Canada on the 3% Project, an initiative to involve 3% of Canadians, about 1 million young people, in a dialogue on climate change. We need this discussion for the sake of our future, and we need these people involved in it. It's inspiring to see these youth councils at work, and I just want to say that our Fleetwood Port Kells Council, I'm very proud of the work you're doing, your energy, your leadership, and your drive to be the engaged citizen our country needs.
Hear, hear. Honourable member for Kootenay, Columbia.
This weekend, over 100 residents gathered in the city of Nelson, in my riding, and thousands more across Canada to send a message that they want the government to keep its word on democratic reform.
Hear, hear.
Following the Prime Minister's announcement that he is breaking his promise to Canadians to end the first-past-the-post system, I received a large number of letters and calls from constituents telling me they feel betrayed, saddened, and angry, and asking me to keep up the fight. Here are the facts. 2/3 of Canadians voted for parties promising electoral reform in the last election. During committee hearings, almost 90% of experts and 80% of public testimony called for the government to adopt a proportional voting system.
Yes,
and during my own democratic reform tour last year, I heard overwhelmingly from voters that they are ready for change. Change will happen in Canada. It will take hard work and political courage, but we can do it, and we must, because that is what Canadians are demanding that we do.
Hear, hear.
The honourable member for Portage Liskeard.
Mr. Speaker, on July 30th, 2008, 22-year-old Tim McLean was on a Greyhound bus bound for home. He didn't make it home. Just outside of Portage-la Prairie, Tim was murdered by a sick and deranged man. The details of what occurred that day are public. It is among the most shocking crimes in Canadian history. Today, Tim McLean's murderer walks free. This individual was granted the right to change his name. He has no limitations on his freedom. There are a lot of people talking about this. There's a lot of outrage because the system isn't working and something needs to change. But let us never forget about the victim, Tim McLean. Tim wasn't the only victim. His family continues to deal with what happened on that day. Tim leaves a son who will never know his dad. So today we stand with Tim's family, particularly his mom, Carol. Carol is one of my constituents, an amazing mom and grandmother who has fought so hard for justice and for what's right. We stand with you, Carol, and with your family. May Tim rest in peace.
Honourable member for Thérèse de Blainville. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Quebec is mobilizing this week with Hooked on School Days, which has been celebrated for 7 years now, to support young people in their effort to succeed in school. This is a movement that was initiated by Partenaires pour la Réussite Scolaire, an organization in the Laurentians, whose remarkable work I wish to underscore under the direction of Annie Grand-Mourcel. By proudly wearing the green and white Hooked on School Days ribbon, we are making a symbolic gesture that is important because 1 in 5 youth leave school before getting a high school diploma. We have to counter this in order to build a more inclusive society. I urge all my colleagues to mobilize around young people to talk to them about effort, perseverance, the risk of dropping out, and the advantage of a diploma, because academic perseverance is everybody's business.
Questions orales, oral questions. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, in 2008, Tim McLean was murdered on a Greyhound bus. His murderer, Vince Lee, is now a free man with an absolute discharge, while Tim's mother will continue to live with this hell for the rest of her life. That just doesn't seem right. But now we also learn that the Prime Minister wants to eliminate mandatory jail time for crimes. So, Mr. Speaker, when will the Prime Minister put the rights of victims ahead of the rights of criminals?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and certainly our hearts go out to the McLean family. I want to be clear that the review boards of the provinces and territories have a specific jurisdiction on whether or not an absolute discharge is provided to persons who are held not criminally responsible. And with regard to the broader criminal justice system review, we are certainly conducting a review, including mandatory minimums, to ensure that we are in compliance with the Constitution and moving forward to improve the efficiencies, effectiveness, and to ensure that public safety remains paramount.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the issue, though, is bigger than that, because we know that the Prime Minister voted against our legislation that was triggered by Tim McLean's death that would make sure that people like Vince Lee would not be allowed out. Right. So when the Minister and the Prime Minister looks at reforming the justice system, it's not about the rights of criminals that we're concerned about on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. We think if people do this, they lose a lot of their rights. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to know what the minister plans on doing to make sure that the victims' rights come first.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, again, our government, and in terms of the review that we're doing of the criminal justice system, hold public safety, the rights of victims. A comprehensive approach is needed to ensure that victims' rights, as well as the realities of the Constitution, are held foremost in our minds. We are conducting a broad review of the criminal justice system, including sentencing reform, over the last 10 years to ensure that the sentencing provisions are in compliance. The courts have spoken quite clearly in terms of the constitutionality of mandatory minimum penalties, and we are going to be proceeding in a concerted way that ensures that the safety and victims.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, beyond traveling to Washington, there are concrete actions that the Prime Minister could be taking to protect Canadian jobs from heading south. He could shelve his carbon tax that will increase the cost of energy and goods that we sell to the United States, and he could stop raising taxes on families. Does the Prime Minister understand that it's actually his decisions here in Canada that are going to make it easier for Trump to steal our jobs?
Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, there's been some improvement in recent job numbers, but the global economy continues to be fragile. That's why it's important that our government continues to focus on the middle class, to lower the taxes of the middle class, to introduce a Canada Child benefit that will lift 300,000 kids out of poverty, to invest in infrastructure, to invest in communities, to invest in innovation. Mr. Speaker, the real question is, why are the Conservatives opposed to those investments that are clearly necessary to grow the Canadian economy, to attract investment and help the middle class?
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, nearly 75% of Canadian exports go to the U.S. Our companies are concerned not only because of the election of a new president, but because of the uncertainty created by this Liberal government. They were nonchalant about the softwood lumber file, the diafiltered milk file. They went back on their promise to lower taxes for SMEs, and they've imposed a carbon tax that will sap the competitiveness of Canadian businesses. Will the Liberal government finally understand that the party's over, that they need to get down to business to create jobs here in Canada? The Honourable Minister of International Trade. Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleague for his question. This is exactly what we're doing. Let's talk about today's meeting between our Prime Minister and the American President, where they will be talking about the solid partnerships that our countries enjoy. It's based on a shared history, a shared culture, and values. And what our Prime Minister is doing today is exactly what Canadians want, Mr. Speaker. They want to have a constructive relationship with our neighbours to the south. And I think that all Canadians are proud of their Prime Minister today, Mr. Speaker. Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, this government has already broken several promises. I want to reach out to the government, as the Leader of the Opposition did today, by making some suggestions. They could be proactive and lower the tax burden on businesses. They could eliminate tariff barriers between provinces. They could abandon their carbon tax, which will cost the middle class thousands of jobs. Mr. Speaker, together we can take the lead and create jobs here in Canada. What will the government choose? To sit and watch as our jobs disappear, or to take action and create jobs for the middle class? The Honourable President of the Treasury Board. Mr. Speaker, there have been improvements in economic growth and job creation recently. But the global economy is still fragile. We need to continue to make significant investments in the middle class to help families and children. And we need to invest in infrastructure. The Conservatives want to cut investments in families and infrastructure. We are listening to Canadians, and we will continue to invest in the middle class to promote economic growth.
Giver East.
More and more people are demanding Canada to end the Safe Third Country Agreement with the U.S. Immigration lawyers are now saying many refugee applications have to be rejected because of this agreement. The minister continues to turn a blind eye and be complicit to the reality these refugees are facing. On Friday in this House, the Parliamentary Secretary for Public Safety admitted that, quote, obviously a number of these issues are emerging. If the government admits there's a problem, Why won't they do anything about it?
Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, our country has been recognized as having one of the most compassionate refugee systems in the world. The U.S. Safe Third Country Agreement between Canada and the United States is crucial to the handling of asylum claimants in both countries. We have no indication whatsoever that the U.S. executive order has had any impact on the Safe Third Country Agreement. We continue to welcome newcomers into our country. All refugee claimants get fair access to a fair hearing, and all claims and cases are judged on their merits.
The Honourable Member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie. Mr. Speaker, the Minister has again told us that they don't have any proof that the recent executive order is having an impact on our refugees. Well, here's some news. All across the country, like in Emerson, Manitoba, and in Hemmingford in the Eastern Townships, there are people braving the winter weather and the snow to seek refuge in Canada. And we can't just turn away these people, given the current circumstances. So what is the government waiting for to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement?
Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member knows that the Safe Third Country Agreement applies to asylum claimants. It has no bearing on refugees resettled from abroad, which is what the executive order is about. She knows that. Having said that, we're proud to have a compassionate refugee system in Canada. All refugee claimants get a fair hearing at the Immigration Refugee Board, and all cases are judged on their merits.
The Honourable Member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie. Mr. Speaker, this morning my colleagues, the NDP leader and the member for Sherbrooke, met Mr. Yassine Habert. This 19-year-old Quebecer was turned away at the U.S. border last week as he was going to Boston for a competition, a sports competition. This young man still doesn't understand why he was refused entry to the U.S. What does this government intend to do to ensure that Canadian citizens are not at a risk of being turned away at the U.S. border without any valid reason? The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleague for her question. Obviously, we share her concern about the situation she just described. We are constantly striving to ensure that when Canadians travel abroad, that they are treated appropriately and fairly. But we have to recognize that all countries have the right to decide at their border which people they will allow entry to. We encourage people who have concerns to get in touch with the minister.
Last week, another Canadian came forward about being turned away at the U.S. border. Immediately following Trump's discriminatory ban, the Liberal government promised no Canadians would be affected. This is clearly not the case. Canadians are being stopped, interrogated, and turned away at the U.S. border, even though they have valid Canadian passports. Let's just call it for what it is: racial profiling, and it's outrageous. What is the minister doing to guarantee that Canadians are not being treated this way at the U.S. border?
Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we share that member's concern with respect to this situation. The government constantly works to ensure that Canadians receive fair and proper treatment when they travel abroad. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, I think we must recognize that every country makes its own decisions as to whom they admit on their territory. I would encourage anyone who has concerns about treatment like that to take the necessary measures with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to bring this matter to their attention as well.
Honourable Member for Carleton.
A proposal by leaders in Congress to impose a 20% border-adjusted tax could kill hundreds of thousands of Canadian jobs. 1/5 of our economy is exports to the U.S., so it would be a 20% foreign tax on 1/5 of our economy. Yet our foreign minister reportedly told the author of the proposal, House Speaker Paul Ryan, that the government of Canada has no position on the border-adjusted tax. Did the Prime Minister make the same mistake, or did he stand up against the tax when he met with the President?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When in Washington, the Minister met with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, House Speaker Paul Ryan, Senators John McCain, Bob Corker, and Ben Cardin, The minister made it clear that Canada is strongly opposed to any imposition of a new tariff between Canada and the United States. I'm sure that every member of this House agrees with us on that point, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Carleton.
Well, the question was on the tax, not the tariff, but another question I asked through access to information was on the impact of the new carbon tax. The government blacked out the data, relying on Section 18D of the Access Act, which allows them to withhold information, quote, that could, quote, reasonably be expected to be materially injurious to the financial interests of the government institution or to the ability of the Government of Canada to manage the economy. If mere public knowledge of the effects of the carbon tax is so damaging that it needs to be hidden, what does that say about the tax itself?
The Honourable Minister of Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm always happy to speak to the opposition about the merits of putting a price on pollution. It's actually a free market solution to something we don't want, which is pollution, and actually will do what we do want, which is create good jobs, clean growth, and innovation. But once again, don't take it from our party and from leading economists and from job makers. Let's talk about former MP Patrick Brown, Ontario Conservative leader. A price on carbon is coming, and it's going to come everywhere. Conservatives can't run from the debate on the environment.
Order.
The Honourable Member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Liberal government is acting like a company that is on the verge of bankruptcy. It's like you had a successful company whose wealthy owner passed the torch to a new administration, and that new administration is now spending recklessly. To be clear, Mr. Speaker, the former owner in this case was Stephen Harper, who left the country with a surplus of more than $1 billion. And the new one, you guessed it, is our current Prime Minister, who doesn't have a plan. Mr. Speaker, can this liberal government take action, create wealth, create permanent jobs, and give hope back to Canadian families? The Honourable President of the Treasury Board. Mr. Speaker, as a government, we inherited a sluggish economy after 10 years of Conservative governance. And at the same time, we didn't inherit a surplus. In fact, we created a deficit because the Conservatives fabricated a surplus before the election, but it's clear that there wasn't a surplus. It's very clear that for us, the important thing is to invest in the middle class, invest in infrastructure, and create economic growth. And that's exactly what we'll continue to do. The Honourable Member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. Order. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We need to support Canadian workers who get up every morning and work hard to provide for their families. We need to allow them to accumulate wealth so that they can have a certain financial freedom. This government is not allowing Canadian families to have more money in their pockets. It gives with one hand and takes with the other. This Liberal government is not telling the truth. Canadians now have less money to spend. Can this government stop taking money out of taxpayers' pockets and commit to not cancel any more tax credits, like the one for the seniors' pension plan or for RESPs for our Canadian families?
The
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. It's our government, Mr. Speaker, who is committed to help the middle class and to help those who are working hard to join the middle class. It is our government that has reduced taxes for the middle class, and they voted against it. It's our government that introduced the Canada Child Benefit. Again, Mr. Speaker, the government across the way voted against it. Mr. Speaker, we have a plan, and we have a plan to support the middle class. Thank you.
For Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals have broken their promise of supporting the middle class. They have run multi-billion-dollar deficits with no end in sight, removed income splitting, canceled tax credits for children's fitness, arts courses, textbooks, and education, lowered the contribution limit for tax-free savings accounts, and to top it off, introduced a national carbon tax. These Liberal tax increases are costing struggling Canadian families substantially more. Will the Prime Minister quit falsely claiming to support the middle class and reverse these aggressive tax increases?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and once again I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. I have to remind the House once again, Mr. Speaker, that it's this government that is committed to supporting the middle class and those that are working so hard to join it. It is this government, Mr. Speaker, that has lowered the taxes for middle-class Canadians, that has actually helped thousands and thousands and thousands of Canadians. It's this government, Mr. Speaker, that has introduced the Canada Child Benefit Program that has lifted hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. Mr. Speaker, our government supports the middle class. We have a plan, and we are moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Kathleen Wynne and the Prime Minister seem to have a lot in common, judging from the hugs, and that's bad news for Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Wynne has already destroyed Ontario business by driving the price of hydro sky high and implementing the "it won't help the planet, just the liberal pocketbook cap and trade system." Her buddy, the Prime Minister, is following the same instruction manual and driving the cost of living up. Well, Mr. Speaker, this plan is messed up and my constituents are fed up. When will the Prime Minister learn from the mistakes of the Wynne Liberals and quit repeating them?
Honourable Minister of Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What we aren't going to do is repeat the mistakes of the previous Conservative government, where they did nothing on the environmental front. We are committed to taking serious action to tackle climate change, not just because we care about our children and grandchildren, but also because it makes economic sense. We're going to make sure that we invest in clean jobs and innovation, and we're going to be a leader, and we're going to attract jobs and investment, because that is the right thing to do, and that's what Canadians expect us to do.
Order. The Honourable Member for Essex.
Last week, Ontario joined Quebec in calling for federal loan guarantees for softwood lumber producers, which would provide certainty to forestry workers who fear their jobs will be lost when the U.S. imposes duties. Canadians expect the Prime Minister will convey to President Trump the importance of protecting hundreds of thousands of jobs in both countries that depend on a strong Canada-U.S. relationship. Will this government assure Canadians that protecting jobs will be their #1 priority, and will they provide loan guarantees to protect Canadian softwood lumber jobs?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, we're preparing for any situation and will continue working on a good deal for our Canadian forestry industry. Our government takes very seriously the challenges ahead for this sector, and we are working hard with our provincial partners to protect forestry jobs across Canada. We will continue to work with lumber producers, workers, provinces and territories to find a solution that works for our forest industry.
The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Well, it's nice to hear the same thing over and over, but we really want concrete actions. Last week, Quebec and Ontario both took the same position on the softwood lumber file. Today, the Prime Minister is meeting the American President, and we hope that he will be able to defend our interests. In the meantime, the threat of customs tariffs on exports to the U.S. looms over the industry. The government needs to create a loan guarantee program for lumber producers. Will the minister hear the calls from Quebec and Ontario about the urgency of creating a Plan B? The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
How important the forestry sector is for Canadians, particularly in certain parts of the country. We know that the industry is dependent on exports, particularly to the United States, and that's why we are in constant touch with my counterparts at the deputy ministerial level. We will be prepared for every eventuality, and our primary interest is to protect those good jobs in the forestry sector wherever they are across Canada.
The Honourable Member for Parry Sound, Muskoka.
Speaker, Canadians were shocked last week by the release of Vincent Lee with no conditions or monitoring and was even legally allowed to change his name to Will Baker. This is the man who brutally murdered Tim McLean on a bus in 2008, to the horror of all those on board and indeed to the entire country, Mr. Speaker. Now, Tim's family is left to deal with this latest ordeal and outrage. Can the minister please tell Canadians why the rights of the McLean family and the public are secondary to this vicious murderer?
Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, certainly our hearts go out to the McLean family. The public safety of Canadians is always of utmost concern to our government, and we are committed to ensuring that our criminal justice system provides the greatest protection possible. I want to be clear. The review board of the province or territory makes the decision to grant an absolute discharge in terms of not criminally responsible, and it would be inappropriate for me to comment further. But again, our hearts go out to the McLean family, and in terms of the work that we're doing around criminal justice reform, we are moving forward to ensure safety and protection for victims.
The honourable member for Niagara Falls.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Liberals have a problem with mandatory jail sentences for criminals. Now, is it the mandatory jail time for selling drugs around a school, or child pornography, or for kidnapping a child? Or maybe it's the mandatory jail time from drive-by shootings or premeditated murder. Mr. Speaker, which criminals does the Minister of Justice believe need a break?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm pleased to stand up again to speak about the comprehensive review that our government is undertaking in terms of the criminal justice system, including sentencing reform. And I am pursuing that with vigor. I want to actually say, with respect to mandatory minimum penalties, which is included in this review, the courts have spoken out quite clearly in terms of the constitutionality of these provisions. And our government believes that it's important to ensure that the laws, including mandatory minimums, are effective at meeting their objectives, the efficiency and promoting public safety, and most importantly, ensuring their compliance with the Constitution.
Member for Niagara Falls.
Speaker, the minister doesn't want to be specific because the Liberals have a problem with prison sentences. I'm proud of the fact that under our Conservative government, anyone who brings drugs into this country for the purpose of selling to our children will go to jail. I'm proud of that, Mr. Speaker. Why wouldn't the Liberals concentrate on filling judicial appointments and not be worried about mandatory sentences?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, again, I'm happy to rise to speak about the comprehensive review of the criminal justice system that we are undertaking, including sentencing reform, and this includes looking at all of the mandatory minimums that are now contained within the criminal code. As I said, the courts have spoken out in terms of the constitutionality of many of these provisions, and it is in that regard that we are reviewing them. I firmly believe that we must inject discretion back to judges to be able to administer an appropriate sentence based on the individual that is before them. We are doing this in a thoughtful way and ensuring that we engage with many stakeholders, provinces and territories as we reform these mandatory minimums.
The Honourable Member for Beauport, Côte de Beaupré, Île d'Orléans, Charlevoix. Mr. Speaker, for some time now, we've seen the Liberal Party becoming laxer and being more and more inclined to reduce sentences for criminals. This Liberal government's priority clearly seems to be giving criminals lighter sentences, as with their Bill C-38. It seems like they care more about criminals than they do about the victims and their families. When will this Prime Minister stand up for victims of crime?
Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, I thank the member for the multi-pronged question, and again, we are pleased to be doing a comprehensive review of the criminal justice system, including sentencing reform, to ensure that we provide a way forward that is comprehensive, that speaks to what we have heard from stakeholders, from provinces and territories, and what we're hearing from judges, in order to ensure that the judges have the necessary discretion in order to administer the appropriate sentence based on the individual that presents before them. And in terms of Bill C-38, I was pleased to introduce that bill to combat human trafficking and to provide protection to vulnerable people in this country.
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister must defend Canadians from attacks on privacy by President Trump. We have very serious concerns with respect to Bill C-23. Americans on Canadian soil will be armed, can conduct strip searches, will be able to hold Canadians and question them.
Just released between the Prime Minister and the President. Instead of standing up for Canadians, they decided to double down on information sharing and measures like this that go against Canadians' rights. Can the Minister stand up and confirm that he will, in the clearest of terms, that they will stand up for Canadians' rights once and for all?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And certainly for this government, making sure the balance
of protecting Canadian rights and furthering our economy is at the foremost of our consideration. And when we take a look at that, pre-clearing has already happening in 8 locations. It's more than 12 million passengers every year using this, that it facilitates the movement of goods and services, it increases security, and it makes sure that Canadians can travel directly to locations they otherwise would not be able to in the United States. Let me say as clearly as I can that absolutely and without question U.S. officials in Canada require at all times to comply with Canadian law and to the Canadian Charter.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Mr. Speaker, last weekend another 21 refugees looking for safety walked for hours through snowy fields to get to Canada through Emerson, Manitoba. Repeated calls on the government to take concrete, immediate actions like suspending the Safe Third Country Agreement continue to go unanswered while these individuals are literally risking life and limb. If some poor farmer were to find a refugee family laying in his field, would the Minister of Immigration continue to repeat the same lame non-answer we've heard for weeks? Would he have the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans repeat them for him? Will the Minister finally suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement now? What's it going to take, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to begin by thanking the people of Emerson for their generosity in welcoming those who are seeking protection in difficult circumstances. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad for the member opposite to ask me the question because my department moved very, very quickly to engage with CBSA, RCMP and the town of Emerson this weekend after the arrival of 21 asylum claimants. We worked with the Manitoba Interfaith Immigration Council and the local resettlement organization to provide transportation to asylum seekers from Emerson to Winnipeg, and the settlement organization has offered asylum claimants a place to stay if needed.
Member for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Monsieur le Président, on February 2nd, the Minister of Natural Resources led an official visit and trade mission to Mexico. Included in the delegation were 37 Canadian business leaders from mining, energy, and clean technology sectors, making the trip one of the Natural Resource Canada's biggest ever. Also, for the first time, Indigenous representatives were part of the delegation. Can the Minister of Natural Resources please give more information about his trip to Mexico and how it positions Canada to continue a strong relationship with an important continental partner?
Minister.
Speaker, I'd like to thank the honourable member from Etobicoke Lakeshore for his question. Promoting Canadian business around the world is an important priority for my department, and I have just returned from a very productive mission to Mexico, where I discussed collaboration on energy and mineral development with my counterparts, as well as with local communities and Indigenous peoples. Our country signed a memorandum of understanding on collaboration in sustainable mining that will lay the foundation for greater trade opportunities, stronger growth, and job creation for years to come.
Honourable member for Prince Albert.
Mr. Speaker, NAFTA has been a successful agreement for Canada, but the Prime Minister has offered it up for renegotiation. Since it came into force, we have gained over $5 trillion in direct investment and millions of high-paying jobs. Now the Liberal government is putting all of this on the table. Canadians want to know, when the Prime Minister committed to renegotiating NAFTA, what specific elements of the existing agreement did he believe were problematic?
Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians need to know first and foremost that no negotiations have begun yet. Last week, when the Minister of Foreign Affairs was in Washington, she met with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, along with House Speaker Paul Ryan, Senators John McCain, Bob Corker, and Ben Cardin. The minister underlined how integrated our economies are and how they support millions of jobs on both sides of the border. We always have Canada's best interests in mind in our conversations internationally, and I'm sure no one in this House would want us to reveal our hand prematurely.
Member for Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
The Foreign Affairs Minister met with U.S. House Speaker Paul Ryan. He stated that he had a really productive conversation about improving dairy market access, and the minister herself called it a successful visit. We can assume he wasn't talking about more Canadian dairy products flowing into Wisconsin. How much dairy access did the minister offer to the Americans at this meeting?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, it's important to point out that they're not in negotiations that have begun with our counterparts in the United States. The minister met Paul Ryan and other members from U.S. We point out that the integration of the economy is important because it supports millions of dollars on jobs on both sides of the border, and we always have the interests of Canadians at heart in our conversations. I'm convinced that no one here would want our position to be compromised prematurely. Honourable Member for Les Billots-Binières. Mr. Speaker, everything appears to indicate that the upcoming negotiations on NAFTA will affect the agricultural sector. More specifically, sources are reporting that supply management will be an integral part of the negotiations. Mr. Speaker, out of respect for Canadian farmers, can the Liberal government tell us what will be on the table during the negotiations and if the supply management system will be included?
Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
My colleague's question, it gives me an opportunity to say again that Canada's supply management system is a model of stability worldwide. I think my honourable colleague is well aware this is the party that fought hard to put supply management in place. This is the party that will work hard to make sure that supply management remains in place. And my honourable colleague is well aware, Mr. Speaker, that we worked with the supply management system since we came into government and adjusted a number of things that needed to be adjusted, and we are also in favour.
The honourable member for Foothills.
Mr. Speaker, twice the Prime Minister has gone to the United States and he's met with two different presidents and their administrations. But both times he has left the Minister of Natural Resources here at home. When it comes to our resources, the United States is our biggest customer, but also our largest competitor. Now, had the Minister of Natural Resources had the opportunity to go to Washington, he may have been able to talk about some fairly important issues. Softwood lumber, Keystone XL, Canadian jobs. Mr. Speaker, either the Prime Minister has no confidence in this minister, or Canada's natural resources sector is not a priority for this Liberal government. Which is it?
Order. It's good to wait till the minister's introduced. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Since I'm here, Mr. Speaker, I'll talk about our government's accomplishments in the natural resource sector, particularly the 24,000 jobs that we've created by approving pipelines. Or I'll talk about the hundreds of millions of dollars that we have committed to infrastructure in the province of Alberta. Or I'll talk about the commitment of this government to make sure that the economy and energy and the environment go hand in hand, and we're going to prove that through accomplishments, not idle chatter and naysaying.
Churchill River.
Mr. Speaker, 2 months ago, the Indigenous Affairs Minister announced the Manitoba First Nations school system, with those schools set to receive federal funding education. In this agreement, barely 1/3 of the schools in Manitoba are included. To this day, most reserve schools across Canada are not being funded equally with public schools. After decades of poor funding, will the minister fund all of the First Nations schools and give all First Nations children the best education?
The Honourable Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, it was indeed a terrific announcement that we were able to make with the First Nations in Manitoba, who choose to work together on developing a school system where they can develop their own curriculum, develop their own on-the-land programming, their own professional development. This is a very, very historic day. This is an opt-in process separate from the funding in the classroom, where communities who want to work together to develop their own school system come together with separate funding to do just that. We're very proud of that initiative.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow is Have a Heart Day on Parliament Hill. The purpose of the day is to ensure that all children have the services they need and that they are entitled to. But this government was found guilty by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal of systemic discrimination against First Nations children. When will the minister turn words into action and put an end to this discrimination? With another young 12-year-old who committed suicide on the weekend, how do they sleep at night? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, We have committed to reviewing all services to children and families for Indigenous peoples. To make up for the offset in funding, we are investing more than $1 billion over the next 5 years. We are determined to work hard with First Nations, the provinces, and agencies in order to reform the situation.
Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, in 2014, before our troops were ever deployed to Kuwait, our Conservative government ensured that they'd be entitled to full danger pay. If the Defence Minister doesn't believe me, he can check Finance Canada's website. The first cuts by the Liberals were done on September 1st of 2016. If the minister doesn't take action now, a lot more troops on other missions will be impacted in June. It's unjust for the Liberals to take away $1,800 each month from each of our troops who are in harm's way. Will the minister stop funding the Prime Minister's out-of-control spending on the backs of our troops?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Member, for your question. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, we always take care to ensure the well-being of our troops. During a meeting in the region, the minister noted the situation, asked the CDS to take a look at it. An interdepartmental team is looking at it. Measures are in place. We are advancing this file and are working with the relevant organizations based on all recommendations. The Honourable Member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals were caught with their pants down cutting benefits to our soldiers deployed to fight ISIL. This is crass, it's wrong, it lacks class, and it's really Liberal. In order to cover their incompetence, they're blaming the previous government that had nonetheless allocated to these benefits, and that's disgusting. Now, when something goes wrong, you don't ask a subordinate to fix it. Will the minister rectify this affront to our troops? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, the member opposite is trying to play petty politics at the expense of our soldiers. The previous government didn't hesitate in the past to reduce expenditures to defence. They didn't hesitate to do so at the expense of our soldiers, veterans, and their families. So we have no lessons to learn from them with respect to support that we are providing to members of the Canadian Forces.
Member for Calgary, Shepherd.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of International Development admitted on a Sirius XM radio show that Canadians' international aid tax dollars could end up in the hands of ISIS fighters in the Middle East. Her excuse was that Canada must respect aid neutrality. We should never be neutral about mass slaughter of those who use rape as a weapon and those who pose the greatest threat to Canadian security. Organizations that assist ISIS should never receive Canadian taxpayer funding.
Exactly.
Instead of making excuses, will the minister do her job and cut funding to aid groups that are directly supporting ISIS fighters in the field?
Yeah.
The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, my mandate is clear. It is to focus international assistance on people who are the poorest and most vulnerable. I can assure you that our department ensures that all contracts granted, all funding given to our international partners is consistent with rules. We ensure that all our partners are experienced partners and that funds are used for the purposes they are designed to be used for.
For Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
Mr. Speaker, this past Friday, I was pleased to visit Standard Aero in my riding to see the work they are doing to maintain engines for the CP-140 Auroras and CC-130H Hercules aircraft. Standard Aero and the aerospace industry are an important employer of good middle-class jobs in my riding. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement inform this House about recent investments in the aerospace industry in support of our Canadian Armed Forces?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
More good news, Mr. Speaker, for our men and women in uniform. We're committed to providing them with the equipment they need to do the job and to provide good-paying jobs in Manitoba and across Canada. Our government is proud to announce the award of contracts totaling $90 million for the maintenance and repair of engines for our military. These contracts in the West
and in Ontario will not only help maintain the Royal Canadian Air Force's fleet of aircraft, but will also create and maintain 175 good-paying jobs in Canada's aerospace sector. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Banff Airdrie.
Mr. Speaker, in November, the Chief Electoral Officer said that there is no way to restrict or prevent foreigners or foreign organizations from trying to influence Canadian elections, that there's no restrictions on unlimited third-party spending for things like polling, phone banking, or election websites. At committee, the minister claimed that she's committed to ensuring that there's no foreign influence in our elections. However, actions speak louder than words. So if the Liberals are truly committed to preventing foreign interference in Canadian elections, will they commit today to closing these loopholes?
The Honourable Minister, Democratic Institutions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for his question and also for his interest in the safety and protection of our democracy. Canada has one of the most comprehensive political financing systems in the world that restricts foreign influence in Canadian elections. International entities cannot give money to political parties or candidates. Offences and penalties are in place for contravening these rules. Transparency is a key aspect of the Canadian political financing regime. Political parties, candidates, and third parties all file reports with the Chief Electoral Officer on their contributions and expenses, and I look forward to working with all members to ensure the integrity of our democratic system. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Naimo Ladysmith.
Every year, 5,500 cases of sexual assault are reported to police, but 1 in 5 are deemed to be unfounded. We need to create a culture that takes victims of sexual assault seriously, especially when 90% of sexual assaults are never reported. But we also need to call out misogyny and sexual harassment wherever it occurs, from the office to the Oval Office. How could the Prime Minister possibly sit down and discuss women in the workforce with President Trump without first denouncing his misogynistic comments?
The Honourable Minister for the Status of Women.
Mr. Speaker, we can all agree that women are important contributors to our economy domestically, but also globally, and that when all citizens are included in the economy, we all benefit. The fact that this is a priority at the first official meeting between our Prime Minister and the President is a reflection of how much we value innovation, promoting and advancing gender equality, and growing the economy. Our government's committed to increasing women's participation in the workforce. Having more women participating is good for economy and society.
The Honourable Member for Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge.
Mr. Speaker, I have the privilege of sitting on the Human Resources Committee, which has been studying poverty reduction, traveling to communities across Canada, including my own riding of Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge, to explore innovative ways our government can tackle poverty. Could the Minister please inform this House on his plans to implement a national poverty reduction strategy?
Minister of Social Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the member from Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge, for his great work on behalf of his constituents and as a member of the Human Resources Parliamentary Committee. Our government is committed to enhance the economic well-being of all Canadian families. Today, we launched 2 initiatives to support the development of our poverty reduction strategy. First, a nationwide consultation process. Second, the selection process for an advisory committee on poverty. We want to hear the views of all Canadians on how to help more Canadians join and grow the middle class.
Honourable Member for Fort McMurray, Cold Lake.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister made a unilateral decision to ban Arctic oil and gas drilling in the Northwest Territories and Nunavut without consulting the premiers. Just 2 hours before telling the public, he had the courtesy to inform the premiers about his unilateral decision. With such significant implications for territorial governments and Northerners, what possible reason could justify not consulting with the premiers?
Exactly. Good question.
The Honourable Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
We had a very good meeting in the North last week with both the Premier Taptuna as well as Premier McLeod. As you know, there's no active drilling occurring in the Beaufort Sea. The measures announced by the Prime Ministers in the Joint Arctic Leaders Statement, including establishing Canadian Arctic waters as indefinitely off-limits to new oil and gas licenses, to be informed every 5 years by science-based reviews. Canada will consult with existing license holders in the Beaufort Sea on their interests and their future plans.
The Honourable Member for Montcalm. Mr. Speaker, revelations by the new head of Canadian diplomacy have appalled media in Belgium. Headlines included crocodile tears to mislead Wallonia. Quite a performance by the minister. Fake tears to make Walloons feel guilty. Tactics to create guilt, hypocrisy, crocodile tears. You'd think it was the 1995 Love-In in the downtown Montreal, Mr. Speaker. Is that how the Liberals have decided to conduct Canada's diplomacy from now on? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, Canada appreciates its relationships with other countries and international governments across the world. We are always in conversation with the diplomats and counterparts at an international level, and we're proud of the role that Canada plays across the world. The Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Public Safety stated last week, and I quote, adequate and fair treatment of all Canadians seeking to enter the United States is a priority for the current government. One heck of a priority. 5 days later, a Quebec athlete from Sherbrooke, who's accustomed to competitions abroad, was stopped at the border. How many Quebecers will have to be turned back at the border because of the color of their skin, the sound of their voice, or the God they believe in, or because they look suspicious? Will there have to be before the government starts to take some action? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share the concerns raised by my honourable colleague opposite on this situation. We are working very hard to ensure that all Canadians are treated fairly, equitably, when they travel abroad. At the same time, each country makes its own decisions regarding eligibility for entry. Any person who has been denied access or entry at the border, I would encourage to raise the issue. The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Mr. Speaker, apart from the rhetoric and great principles or grand principles that don't change anything, what we want to know is what specific steps have been taken to ensure that all Quebecers, regardless of their faith, are not unfairly targeted at the Canada-US border. What we want to know was, or is, who the minister talked to, what demands were made, what commitments were made, and whether he can ensure that all citizens will no longer be victims of discrimination at the border. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member opposite for his question. This is a priority for Canada. It's a priority to ensure that Canadians can travel. Without facing problems. So if there are problems at the borders, I would encourage them to speak to the U.S. authorities. That concludes question period today.
Order. Order. I ask members to take their conversations out into the lobbies. I have a point of order from the Opposition House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I'm noticing that we're developing a bit of a bad habit in this hallowed place. Right after question period, we tend to take a lot of time chattering and visiting, and I think in respect for this place, we should take our talk immediately after question period outside of the chamber so that we can proceed immediately to orders of the day. So I know you're doing an excellent job, and you can only get as much order as we give you. So I think, though, that if you would be willing to immediately call this place to order, that would send a strong signal, and I would encourage all of my colleagues immediately when question period is over to leave the chamber if you need to chat, or else sit and give this place the respect that it deserves and listen to what's going on next.
I thank the Opposition House Leader for her intervention, and it seems to have had salutary effect already. The tabling of documents, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 30,